Practicing discernment in time. Although numerous spiritual disciplines can facilitate the discernment process, the following five are particularly valuable when discerning how to engage God's time. The first entails being mindful in one's use of technology. The second discipline focuses on regularly attuning ourselves to the present. Third, prayer is essential. The fourth is keeping holy days as holy. And finally, learning to take mini breaks throughout the day, which can attune us to the present. Although it may not at first seem like a spiritual practice, being mindful in the use of technology requires spiritual discipline. Foremost, it is important to note that technologies such as smartphones and tablets can be wonderful tools for facilitating spiritual practices, including prayer, meditation, and the study of sacred text. However, far too often we become enslaved to our phones and other devices, and the ways they lure us away from engaging time as God's time. There are three important tips for curbing the dangerous ways in which technology can intrude upon God's time. The first step is to only acquire the technological tools that we absolutely need. The second is to learn only the technology that is needed to fulfill God's call in our lives. Technology advances at breakneck speeds. Attempts to always have or know the latest and greatest in technological advances can impede one's ability to see the use of technology as being towards the service and love of God. Finally, establish tech-free zones or times in your day when you are off the grid. Feeling the need to be constantly accessible is often about serving one's ego, not God, making a false idol of yourself and your importance. Being constantly plugged into technology can also be a way of procrastinating other tasks. When one is able to set limits and boundaries on the use of technology, it is then easier to practice the second spiritual discipline, attuning one's mind and heart to the present. This requires metacognition, or being mindful of one's thoughts, as most often it is the mind that pulls one into the past or the future. When we find that our mind is ensnared by thoughts of the past or the future, invite oneself back to the present. This may require gaining insight into why thoughts of the past and future have such a powerful lure for you. This can be due to a vast number of emotions, such as guilt and shame, or fear and anxiety, and even excitement and exhilaration. Acknowledging these thoughts and the related feelings, and inviting oneself back into a present state of mind, entails being mindful in a way that can be facilitated by prayer, the third spiritual practice. According to Thomas Merton, if we really want to pray, we'll have to give it time. We must slow down so that we have time to listen. And as soon as we listen to what's going on, things will begin to shape themselves. For this, we have to experience time in a new way. The reason why we don't take time as a feeling and understand its impact on our lives is that we are constantly moving. That is a real sickness. To live in the fullness of time we need to take time, because every moment is God's own time. The whole thing boils down to giving ourselves in prayer a chance to realize that we have what it seeks. We don't have to rush after it. It is there all the time, and if we give it time, it will make itself known to us. Prayer happens in God's time. Although established and disciplined times of prayer are helpful, the ability to be present to and to listen to God means that time is fluid, not fixed. Living in the fullness of time means placing prayer and the act of listening for the voice of God above all else. Moving through prayer with urgency is an indication that one is not engaging God's time. By slowing down to pray and slowing down in our prayers, our hearts and ears are opened wider to experience God's response. The fourth spiritual discipline that can aid one in discerning how to engage God's time is honoring holy days. Honoring holy days is a reminder that in God's time, the emphasis is on being rather than doing. Scripture indicates that God's concern for humanity is focused on humanity's ability to love rather than our ability to produce. In addition, holy day practice invites one away from a false idolization of self, work, and money, as it is an intentional means of pausing in one's toil to awaken to joy, rest, and community. Leaders quite often face challenges in honoring holy days. If your job requires work on traditional or culturally constructed holy days, then God is calling you to another day for renewal. Living in God's time, in the fullness of time, affords all God's children with a day for honoring God. Failure to identify or honor that day is an indication that further discernment on how to engage God's time is needed, as it is likely that you have placed other priorities and demands above the commandment to love God and love of neighbor. A fifth and final spiritual practice that can aid in discerning God's time is referred to as mini breaks, intentional ways of pressing pause throughout the day in order to attune to the present, to God. When you find yourself moving faster, God is inviting you to a mini break, an opportunity to re-establish your focus on God and God's commandments, especially the commandment to love. Mini breaks can include taking a breath break by spending as little as 1 minute or as long as 30, centering oneself and one's attention on deep, diaphragmatic or belly breathing. Another option is to adopt a mantra or a meditative phrase that refocuses attention on the fullness of time rather than any sense of urgency. A phrase as simple as, "I am present to the fullness of God's time," can lure you to slow down, to stop trying to walk faster into the future, and to be present to the present. Pausing in the busyness to repeat such a phrase is a means of inviting God back to the center or the foreground of one's consciousness and inviting oneself out of the future and into the present.